I'm John Buchanan. Now, at the time of recording this particular monologue, it's been over 2 years since I have visited, or we're about to revisit, but visited the concept of the nested track stack. This kind of more sophisticated way of us being able to put track stacks within other track stacks. And whilst that first video was very much an introduction, what we're going to do within this video is to look at a more musical context for how and why that might be really valuable to you as your mixes become a little bit more sophisticated. We need to be a little bit careful when it comes to mixing certain types of things within our tracks, and we're going to visit what those things are within this video. Firstly, let's just listen to 8 bars of fairly chilled out music. I know, you didn't know I could be that funky, but it turns out, yeah. Okay, so what we're going to be doing within this video is actually focusing first and foremost on the drums, although we are going to come back to the other parts as well. Now at the moment, as you can see, everything that's drummy in this project, is drummy a word? It is now, is up here at the top, and everything is just running straight out of Logic. All of these sounds are being routed straight to the stereo output. All of them are just their own track doing their own thing. And I've labeled things. So we've got a kick, we've got a couple of snares. I think actually one of those is a clap. So when I say I've labeled things, and we've got a couple of loops. We've got software instruments, we've got audio tracks. It's the usual thing. When we come to programming, we've got a whole collection of things. Now, what track stacks, as we know, allow us to do is to take complementary groups of sounds and sub-mix those. And to understand exactly what I mean, let's open up the mixer. So at the moment, you can see that every single sound is being routed straight through to the stereo output, which is here, which effectively is where all of the sounds are being sent then onto the speakers or to your headphones, however you choose to work. What I have a chance to do if I select all of the drum parts is to, and I'll keep the mixer open so you can see what happens as I do it, Control-click these tracks and to create a track stack. And if of the options I choose here, I select the summing stack, what then happens is that effectively a sub-mix is created. And what that means is that these sounds stop being routed directly to the stereo outputs, and instead they are routed to the first available auxiliary bus, which it turns out is bus number 2, because the first one is being set up for an effect, which we're going to come back to. And these are the place where all of the drums are sent. They are then routed to the track stack master channel, which is here. Its input is bus number 2. Remember, all of those sounds are being sent to bus 2. So the drum's input is bus number 2, and it is being sent to the stereo output. And the advantage of that is it means that anything I do on this channel here is going to affect everything to do with the drums. Now, at the moment, I've got all of those individual tracks soloed. I'm going to turn those off, and instead what I'm going to do is I'm going to solo the track stack, which I'm going to call drums, because of course that is what's being routed to that place. And yes, I know we are repeating lots of things that we've looked at on the channel so far, but let's start from the very beginning. So here is my track stack. It now is being soloed. I've named it. And of course, what I should expect to hear is my drums sounding exactly as they did before. After all, I don't want to change volume or do anything. I don't want the track stack to determine those things for me. I just want it to be a place where I can control all of the drums. Okay, so what are the advantages of track stacks? Well, obviously the first one of those is I've now got a volume control for all of the drums. Rather than having to select all of these individual tracks and adjust their volume, I've now got one fader which is going to control all of them. Fine, and obviously the same thing is going to be true with pan. What we also know with track stacks is that I've got a chance to now think about the drums as a whole group. So if, for example, what I wanted to do was to compress all of the drums together, I can. So I could come to the Studio FET model, I could select my threshold and my ratio, and I could effectively compress all of the drums together with every single track contributing to the way that the compressor is going to behave. Now, this is where we begin to understand the difference between individual tracks and track stacks. If I wanted to just compress the kick drum, I would place the compressor on this track where the kick is. If I wanted to just compress the top loop, I could do that by compressing just this track. But if I want to compress all of the drums together so that the behavior of the compressor is affected by all of the drums coming into the compressor, then putting a compressor on the track stack channel is what I'm going to do. And now all of those drums will combine to affect the way that the compressor behaves. Now this is where the idea of a nested track stack starts to become a bit more interesting. What if what I wanted to do was to compress the top loop and let's say the loop that's happening underneath it? I've got two separate audio tracks that are happening within this particular mix, but I didn't want to compress the kick or the snare drum or the clap. How might I do that? Well, the only way I suppose I could do that if I didn't want to create a nested track stack, we'll come to those in just a second, would be to say, okay, well, I've got my compressor here. I don't want it to affect the kick drum anymore. I don't want it to affect the snare drum or the clap. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to move it onto the top loop here, and I'm going to copy its settings to the other loop, which is sitting on the separate track here. Well, that would work. I've now got a compressor on both of those individual channels, and that now means that the kick is no longer compressed, and nor is the snare and nor is the clap, but both of the loops are. But there's another way that I can do it. What I'm actually going to do is to remove this compressor altogether. Let's get rid of it. And what I'm going to do instead is to select the top loop and the this life beat 02. That's quite a hard thing to say for obvious reasons. And what I'm going to do is to repeat the process of creating my track stack. Okay, so once again, I'm going to create a track stack. And now what happens, I again have the option to choose my summing stack, which is always what I want. There is never, by the way, a situation in which I would ever select a folder stack. Just wouldn't do it. There we are, I've said it. Bold, isn't it? And then what happens is when I press return, I get another track stack. Okay, so let's have a look at the routing for a moment. What's happening now? Well, here is my stack within my stack. This is, I'm going to call this audio loops. These are the drum loops within this stack. Okay, so what's happening here? Well, it turns out that both of these tracks are now being sent to bus number 3. Its track stack is here with bus 3 as its input, and the bus 3 input is then being sent to bus 2 to join the rest of the drums. Does that make sense? I hope it does. What it means is that I've now got a little submix for the two loops. So let's start with something straightforward. If I decided the loops as a sort of proportion of the overall drum mix were too loud, the first thing I can now do is to say, you know what, I'm going to just turn the loops down within the context of the drum mix overall. Equally, I might decide they're not loud enough, in which case I can push them above 0, and that means that relative to the balance of everything else, they're going to be louder than they were before. So a little separate volume control is useful. Also means that I could fade them in or have them be at different volumes. And yes, I could do that with each individual track with automation, but it's quite useful to have this little group of things sort of submixed in this way. As we've already established, what that also means is that I could now compress these. So for instance, I could come back and recreate the settings that I had before and create a compression solution for just those loops. But it also means that I can sort of work on different type of effects. So for instance, rather than having a compressor, what if I decided that for the two loops, what I wanted to do was to have the sounds filter up from, let's say, a really murky start. So over the course of the first 4 bars, what I want is for the loops to kind of emerge from this kind of murky place, become brighter, and by the time we get to bar 5, they are fully established. Well, that would sound like this. And that's a nice effect too, where suddenly what I've got is this kind of sense of part of the drum mix joining in the rest of it. And again, imagine for a second that these loops weren't just 2 tracks, but they were made up of 16 bits of different audio. Again, applying that same filter to all of those separate tracks, copying all that automation data from one track to another. It's much more useful to fold them down in the way that we have to create this nested track stack effect. And we could record that automation right now. I'm going to just do that actually. So of course, the next thing to say is that part of the advantage of a nested track stack is I've now got the opportunity to record automation for this kind of submix within the drum mix. Let's just exactly recreate the effect I did a moment ago. Stop playing. So by the time we get to bar 5, we have this effect. And of course, as always, I can open up the automation lane. And if I want to change this line that I've created, I'm in a position to do that. Or if I'm happy with it, I can come back to read mode and protect it. And of course, what that means is that this is a separate collection of bits of automation to anything I might choose to do on the main group. So I could still return to my overall drum mix and I could add a compressor. Now, the reason I'm laboring this point is because I really want you to think about the different stages of the processes that we're going through. So think about it like this for a moment. These 2 audio loops are being sent to their own submix where they have a filter which emerges over the first 5 bars. They are part of an overall drum mix, which also includes the kick, the snare, and the clap. And all of those things are being compressed at the main track stack for all of the drums. So the filtering is being applied to just 2 elements of that, but it's not being applied to the other 3. Now, a useful question might be, I like that idea, but what if I want to put the clap sound in with the loops so that that joins the filter? Well, all I've got to do is to move a couple of tracks around. So if I wanted to create that effect, I wanted to take this clap sound and I wanted it to join these 2 audio loops so that it also benefited from this filter movement. All I have to do is to grab the clap part and drop it in the gap between those 2 tracks. And automatically what it will do is to reassign it to bus number 3. And what that then means is that it is part of the submix which is being filtered. And we could do the same thing with the snare if we wanted, if suddenly it felt a bit weird that that wasn't part of that too. So now only the kick isn't being filtered. And of course, if it turns out that actually I prefer it the way that it was, I can take those 2 tracks, I can move them out of that stack. And what happens now is that they rejoin the routing here. So what we have a chance to do with nested track stacks is to start thinking about our mixes in a slightly more sophisticated way. Because what we can do is to say, okay, yeah, all of the drums form part of the drum landscape, but within the context of those, I want to do these things. Now, imagine for a second that rather than 5 tracks, I had recorded a full multi-track drum session, or I was working with Drum Machine Designer and I'd put together a pattern which involved 24 separate drum voices, whether that's lots of 3 or 4 separate kicks, different snares, claps, percussion, toms, you name it. What I have a chance to do is to say, okay, what do I actually want these sounds to do? Do I want special effects like the auto filter? Do I want an overall compression treatment for all of the drums? Are there any drums that I want to keep outside of any of the processing altogether? What if I wanted the kick to not be part of this track stack because I just didn't want it to be part of the compression experience? Well, that's fine. That can absolutely still happen. So it's really worth just remembering that I still have individual control of every sound. If I want to put a compressor on just the kick drum, here is the kick drum track, I can come and do that. If I want to put an effect on the loops, but not the kick and the snare and the clap, well, here is the submix for the loops. It's on this track here. At the moment, it has an auto filter, but we could just as easily add, let's say, chroma reverb here as well, and add a little bit of room reverb to just the loops. And now they are filtered and they have some reverb. And I've also got the potential for all of the drums to still be treated together. And at the moment we have a compressor on those drums. This is also a place where maybe I might add an EQ if the overall tonal shape of the drums needed thinking about as well. Now, at the very beginning of the video, I also mentioned the idea of the fact that auxiliary 1 is currently being used by other elements of the mix, and they are the pitched elements. So what I've got here is I've got my guitar and I've got another bit of guitar. They're both coming from little bits of Apple Loop stuff. And then I've recorded my own electric piano part, which is also part of the mix. Those three things down here sound like this. And when I press stop, you can really hear that tape delay because it's obviously its feedback is continuing. Now, why did I say we need to be careful? Well, what I've done with the drums is I've organised the track stacks for the instrument groups that the drums are. In other words, they're all drum voices. Well, let's suppose I decided that I like the idea of folding my mix down into different instrument groups. I might decide that the two guitar parts would really benefit from being in a track stack of their own, which I could call, go on, shout at the screen. That's right, guitars. So now what's happened is that those two tracks, let's open up the mixer again, are going to have been assigned to the next available auxiliary bus, bus number 4. Remember that we've got 2 buses now of drums within the drums stack. So the next auxiliary bus that is available is bus number 4. They are using this delay that I have set up, which is currently being shared by the guitar and the electric piano. Okay, why do I need to be careful? Well, in a way, it's beneficial for me to think about that delay as either being a guitar delay or a piano delay, because now the delay is kind of inside the track stack for the guitars, but it's also potentially in a track stack for the piano as well. And that means that if I start applying effects processing like auto filtering, as I had for the drums, suddenly that shared auxiliary doesn't really make sense. It's not in with the guitars, it's not in with the pianos, it's kind of straddling this kind of weird world, a weird world between guitars and pianos. Imagine such a place. So it might be a good idea for me to slightly decouple that idea. What I'm going to do instead is I'm going to take the piano delay and I'm going to send this to the next available bus altogether, which is going to be bus number 5, the next one that's sort of available. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy the tape delay settings across to bus 5. And what I'm then going to do is to label these. I'm going to call this guitar delay, and I'm going to call this one piano delay. And what I'm then going to do is to just make sure that I've got that right. So here are my 2 guitars, one of which is here and one of which is here. Bus number 1 feeding this tape delay, which is called guitar delay. And then what I've got is a piano part, which is being sent to an absolutely identical delay, but I've called it piano delay. And the advantage of that is that if I wanted to, what I could now do would be to put the guitar delay in the track stack with the guitars. Let me explain what I mean by that. What I'm going to do is to select one of the guitar parts here, and I'm going to create a track for this guitar delay. And by doing that, because I selected the track first, the guitar delay is now added into the track stack for the guitars. Let's put it up at the top of that stack. Here are the 2 guitar parts, and here is the guitar delay, which is being routed through to bus number 4. And the huge advantage of what I've just done means that if, for example, I decided that I wanted a similar kind of filter trick on the guitars that I've put on the drum loops, what I could do would be to come to the guitar stack, I could set up the auto filter, and I'm then in a position to create that tonal ramp. And the delay will be part of that tonal change because the delay is in with the guitar parts. It's being routed to the same place. And what that means is if I run the guitars and I run the filter movement, we're going to hear that the delay is also being filtered. There it is. And in that way, the delay becomes a much more sort of active track element than if it was just outside of that stack. But the huge advantage is it means that the piano delay, which is a completely separate entity now, can exist with the piano. I haven't put it in with the piano stack because I don't have a piano stack right now, but if I wanted to create one, the effect could go in there too. Now, in other videos, I've looked at some of this in a completely different context. Orchestral programming might not be your thing, but within the template building video, within that little mini series that I made around orchestral programming, we looked at the idea of putting effect processors in track stacks with different instrument groups. And it's so that you can think about the effects that you add to your projects as being part of those instrument groups. And within this video, what we've done is to start to understand that a little bit more. As mixes become more sophisticated, we have an opportunity to create track stacks where groups of sounds can be put together, and then nested track stacks where individual treatments to instruments within a bigger stack can have their own separate little treatments, whether those are filters or compressors or EQs or anything else you might want to just apply to a couple of sounds within a bigger track stack. And then what we've started to do just towards the end of this video is to see that putting effects into those track stacks as well can be really beneficial rather than sharing one auxiliary across a number of different sounds. What do you do then at that point if you suddenly want a particular treatment for a delay, for instance? Well, by separating those out per instrument, we don't run into any trouble. So, lots of sophisticated things within this video, but track stacks are amazing, and nested track stacks allow our mixes to become even more sophisticated.